Good evening, friend. Find a comfortable position, wherever you are, and let the room go quiet around you. If there is a lamp still burning nearby, you might turn it down now, just a little. If there is a phone in your hand, you might set it face down on the table and let it rest too. There is nowhere else you need to be for the next little while, and nothing else you need to do. Tonight we are going somewhere small. Not a battlefield, not a palace, not a courtroom where history was decided by men in expensive suits. We are going into a kitchen, a specific kitchen, in a small town, on one particular morning in the autumn of 1934, when the sky outside is still black and the only light in the house comes from a match being struck against the door of a cast-iron stove. There is a woman standing in that kitchen. She has been awake for 4 minutes. She will not sit down again. Not really, not fully, until nearly midnight. And what she does with those hours, what she carries, what she stretches, what she mends and folds and quietly manages so that nobody around her has to notice how hard she is working, is the story we are going to spend this evening inside. I want you to notice something before we begin. A flour sack, cut open at the seam and washed until the printed pattern goes soft, becomes a child's pillowcase, or an apron, or in time a whole small dress. A worn wool sock becomes something worth another winter if a woman with a wooden darning egg and steady hands decides it will be. That is the kind of history we tell here, not the history of generals and treaties, though that history matters too. The history of hands. The history of one Wednesday, lived all the way through. So settle in properly. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears, which is where most of us carry the day without noticing we are doing it. Let your breathing slow down to something closer to the pace this story is going to move at, because we are in no hurry tonight. There is a whole day ahead of us, hers and ours together, and 24 hours is a long time to walk through, slowly, gently, one small task at a time. Come with me now. It is still dark outside. Somewhere on a quiet street in a small Ohio mill town, a woman named Thelma Voss is about to swing her legs out from under a heavy quilt and press her bare feet against a floor that is colder than she expected it to be. We are traveling back to that morning now so that you can watch what she does with it. And by the time the lamps go out again at the end of her day, I suspect you will think about your own house, your own hands, your own small daily competence, just a little differently. The version you probably carry in your mind is almost entirely wrong. Most of what has been passed down to us about the Depression years arrives as a single flat photograph. A gaunt face, a soup line, a newspaper stuffed into a shoe for warmth. All of that was real, and we will not look away from the hardship tonight, because pretending it was easy would be its own kind of lie. But the photograph leaves out almost everything else. It leaves out the skill. It leaves out the pride. It leaves out the fact that a woman like Thelma Voss ran something closer to a small factory than a household, and ran it with a competence that would put most of us, today, to shame. We tend to remember the Depression through its worst images, and those images earned their place in memory, honestly. But a family surviving those years on almost nothing required something the photographs never captured. A working knowledge spanning cooking, budgeting, medicine, and needlework that took years to build and that nobody at the time thought to call expertise, because it was simply what a wife was expected to know. Tonight, we are going to look at that expertise directly, in real time, hour by hour, rather than glancing past it the way most retellings of this decade tend to do. Tonight, we are going to follow her through a single day in that autumn of 1934, from the moment she wakes in the dark to the moment she banks the fire down to embers and climbs back into bed beside her sleeping husband. We will watch her cook, mend, wash, budget, and manage a household of 5 people on wages that had been cut nearly in half. We will step back, twice, into the larger world she lived in, so that her day makes sense against the full size of what the country was going through. And we will notice, again and again, the particular kind of dignity that comes from doing a hard thing well, quietly, without anyone standing over your shoulder to applaud you for it. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of evening that suits you, if you would rather spend a couple of hours inside a real, textured version of the past than watching another dramatized version of it, I would be glad if you considered subscribing. It costs nothing. It helps this little channel keep finding its way to more tired people who need a quiet place to land, and it means we get to keep making these together. If you feel like it, tell me down in the comments where you are tonight and what the clock says on your wall right now. I read every one, even the ones left at 4 in the morning, wherever you are, and whatever kind of day you have had. I am glad you are here for this one. Now, let us go back to that dark kitchen, because Thelma has just found the matches and the stove is not going to light itself. It is October of 1934 in a small steel town called Ashwell, built along a bend in the Coldwater River in northeastern Ohio. Frost has come early this year. It sits on the fence rails and the tin roofs and the dead grass along the railroad cut, and it will not fully burn off until the sun clears the smokestacks a little after 7. Ashwell is not a large place. Perhaps 9,000 people, most of them tied in one way or another to the rolling mill down by the river, which has been running at half its old capacity for 5 years now and is, even so, the reason this town exists at all. The maples along the schoolyard fence have already dropped most of their leaves, a week or two ahead of an ordinary year, and the older residents on Birch Lane have started saying, the way older residents always do, that an early frost means a hard winter coming. A piece of folk wisdom nobody can prove and nobody quite dismisses either. Not in a town where every extra cold week means real money spent on coal that a family would rather spend somewhere else entirely. The houses closest to the mill are company-owned, narrow frame structures set in rows so tight that a woman hanging wash in one yard can hear her neighbor's radio through the other's kitchen window. Some are covered in tar paper, made to look like brick, a cheap imitation that fooled no one but was cheerful in its effort. Further up the hill, where the ground rises away from the river smoke, sit the older houses, wood frame with real brick chimneys, built back when the mill was young and its owners still lived in town instead of somewhere with better weather. Thelma's street sits on that rise, a compromise position, neither the poorest block in Ashwell nor anywhere close to the best of it. The morning has its own particular sound before the town is even properly awake. The mill whistle blows at 5:30, a long low note that carries clean across the frozen river and rattles the loose window glass in half the houses on Thelma's street. It is not a pleasant sound, but it is a faithful one, and there are mornings when its absence would frighten people more than its presence ever could. A silent whistle means the mill has stopped running, and everyone in Ashwell has watched what a stopped mill does to a town like this one. Beneath the whistle come smaller sounds, a dray horse pulling the milk wagon, its shoes striking the cobblestones down on Furnace Street with a rhythm you could set a watch to, though nobody on this street owns a watch worth setting. A door somewhere, hinges dry, opening onto a porch. The particular creak of a screen door held closed with a nail because the spring broke 2 winters back and nobody has had the 15 cents to replace it. Somewhere down toward the depot, a Model A engine turns over 3 times before it catches, coughing blue smoke into the cold air. And under all of it, low and constant, the smell that belongs to towns like this one and no other kind of town. Coal smoke. First and always, drifting down from 100 kitchen chimneys and mixing with the mineral tang of river mud and the faint sweetness of yeast rising somewhere behind the shuttered front of Kessler's bakery, which will not open its doors for another hour yet. Downtown, 4 blocks of it, wears its hardship differently than the mill blocks do. The brick storefronts along Main Street still have their gold-lettered signs, painted in better years, though several windows now carry the Blue Eagle placard that the National Recovery Administration has asked every cooperating merchant to display. "We do our part," the placard reads, and it hangs in Kessler's window and in the window of the hardware store and in the pharmacy, a small government bird standing guard over a town trying very hard to believe its own recovery is underway. 2 storefronts down from the pharmacy, the space that used to hold a shoe repair shop stands empty, its window soaped over from the inside, one more small failure the town has learned not to mention out loud. Down at the far end of Main Street sits the depot, small and brick, where 2 freight trains still pass through most days carrying coal and finished steel out toward Cleveland and beyond, though the schedule runs lighter than it did before 1929, when a 3rd train ran the same line and the depot kept a full-time agent rather than the part-time man who covers it now. The freight cars rattling through at odd hours have become such a fixture of Ashwell's soundscape that most residents have stopped consciously hearing them at all, the way a family living beside a river eventually stops hearing the water. Only a visitor stepping off in Ashwell for the first time would notice how the whole town seems to pause fractionally each time a train passes, conversations dropping half a register until the noise clears, an old habit built up over decades of Milltown life that nobody could explain if you asked them to. The numbers are worth pausing over, because they explain everything that is about to happen in Thelma's kitchen. Nationally, something close to 1 worker in 5 has no job at all this autumn, a figure that would have been unthinkable to anyone standing on this same street in 1928. The men who do have work, men like Thelma's husband Walter, have mostly kept their jobs by trading full weeks for partial ones. A rolling mill hand in Ashwell earns somewhere around 62 cents an hour this year. Decent money on paper. Except that decent money on paper assumes a full week's shifts, and this year the mill runs 3 days some weeks and 4 in a good one. A dozen eggs costs about 30 cents at Kessler's. A quart of milk runs close to a dime. A loaf of bread, if you are buying bread rather than baking it, costs 8 cents, which is one of the small quiet reasons most women on this street do not buy bread. Coal, which every one of these houses burns to survive an Ohio winter, costs somewhere near $10 a ton, delivered in burlap-covered loads that leave black dust on the porch steps for a week afterward. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely, so let us sit with it a moment. A family living on Thelma and Walter's income, when the mill is running well, might see $45 in a month. Rent on their house runs 18 of that. Coal for the winter months eats another chunk in advance, if they can manage to buy it in the fall when it is cheapest, which requires exactly the kind of planning we are about to watch Thelma perform. What remains has to cover food for 5 people, clothing, shoes, medicine if anyone gets sick, and whatever small mercy might be left over for anything resembling comfort. There is no cushion in a budget like that. There is no month where something does not have to be sacrificed so that something else can be paid. And yet Ashwell, this morning, does not feel like a town in collapse. It feels like a town that has learned, out of pure necessity, an entirely new relationship with its own resources. Women trade eggs for garden vegetables over back fences. The Lutheran church basement runs a canning circle every August and September where 40 families put up peaches and tomatoes together using one enormous shared kettle. Because owning your own is a luxury and sharing one is simply sense, a boy who fixes radios out of his father's garage will trade an afternoon's labor for a dozen jars of Mrs. Halloran's applesauce and consider it a fair wage. This is not a town of victims waiting for rescue. It is a town of people who have gotten remarkably, quietly good at making very little go a very long way. Kessler's, when it finally opens its doors a little after 7, smells the way it has smelled every morning for as long as anyone on Birch Lane can remember. Sawdust on the floorboards, the sharp tang of brine from the pickle barrel near the door, and beneath it all the warm yeast smell that has been drifting out through the walls since well before dawn. Bolts of feed-sack cotton stand upright in a wooden bin near the counter, sorted loosely by pattern rather than by size, so that a woman shopping for flour can just as easily be shopping for next spring's dress without ever admitting out loud that this is exactly what she is doing. A hand-lettered sign taped above the bin reads New Patterns Weekly, a small marketing flourish from the milling company that supplies Kesslers, aimed squarely at women exactly like Thelma, who has been known to walk the length of that bin twice before settling on a sack. Old Kessler himself, a heavy-set man with flour permanently worked into the creases of his hands, keeps a running account for perhaps a third of his regular customers this year, a ledger of his own that mirrors Thelma's in spirit if not in scale, tracking who owes what and trusting, mostly correctly, that it will eventually be paid. It is not generosity exactly, though it functions as something close to it. It is simply the arithmetic of running a store in a town where cash income has become unpredictable enough that refusing credit to every family on reduced mill hours would mean refusing credit to nearly everyone, and a grocer with no customers left standing is no grocer at all. Walk up the rise from Main Street, past the Lutheran church with its one stained glass window that the congregation is still paying off in monthly installments, past the schoolyard where the swing set stands empty and frost-silvered at this hour, and you will come to a narrow street called Birch Lane. 6 houses on each side, none of them large, all of them built by the same contractor back in 1911 from what was, by all accounts, a single set of plans with minor variations. The 4th house on the left has a porch light that never gets used. Because burning it would cost money, nobody in that house considers well spent on light they are not actually using. Behind its dark front window, in a kitchen at the back of the house, a match has just been struck. This is where Thelma Voss lives. This is where our day begins. Thelma is 29 years old. She was born 2 counties over, on a farm that her father lost to the bank in 1922, which is a story she does not tell often and never tells with self-pity. Because in her mind it happened to a great many families, and complaining about it would be a kind of vanity. She remembers that farm mostly in small pieces now, the smell of the henhouse in summer, her mother's hands cracked from lye soap made in a kettle over an open fire rather than a proper stove. The strange hush of a kitchen the morning the bankman came to walk the property with papers under his arm. She was 17 that year, old enough to understand exactly what was happening and too young to do anything about it beyond helping her mother pack what could be carried. It taught her something she has never once said aloud to Walter or to anyone else, which is that a house, however carefully kept, is not actually the thing holding a family together. The people are the thing. The house is only where they happen to be doing it. She married Walter Voss in 1924 when she was 19 and he was 23 years old and had just been taken on at the rolling mill as a catcher. One of the men who stand near the rollers and guide red-hot steel bar with long tongs. A job that pays reasonably well and takes a small toll on a man's hands and forearms that never fully heals. Walter is 33 now. He is quieter than he was when they married, not unhappy exactly, but worn down in the quiet way that comes from a man watching his hours cut year after year and having no way to argue with a mill owner 2 states away in Pittsburgh who has never once set foot in Ashwell. They have 2 children. Raymond is 9, sharp and restless. The kind of boy who takes apart his mother's alarm clock to see how the bell works and then cannot get it back together, which earned him a week of chores, but also, privately, a flicker of pride from his father that Thelma noticed and never mentioned aloud. Alice is 6, quieter than her brother, fond of her rag doll and of sitting under the kitchen table while her mother works, listening to the sounds of cooking the way other children listen to stories. Walter's work at the mill deserves a moment of its own, since it shapes the household's whole rhythm, even though it happens somewhere Thelma never sees. A catcher stands at the delivery end of the rolling stand, watching for the glowing bar of steel to come shooting through the rollers, and reaches out with tongs 6 feet long to catch it, guide it, and feed it back through for another pass. working close enough to metal heated past 1,000 degrees that the men wear no gloves at all, since gloves would only catch fire and burn a hand worse than bare skin exposed briefly to the heat ever could. It is a young man's job in some ways, requiring quick reflexes and a steady nerve, and Walter has begun, this past year, to notice younger catchers moving faster than he once did. A fact he has mentioned to Thelma exactly once. In passing. In the flat. Careful tone men use when they are naming a fear without quite admitting that is what they are doing. Neither of them has said the word out loud, but both of them understand that a catcher's working years have a natural ceiling to them, and that ceiling is closer for Walter than it was 5 years ago. The house also holds Walter's mother, Hilda, 61 years old and widowed 3 years back, who moved in with them the same month her husband died because the alternative, a small room in a boarding house on the money a widow's pension provided, was no alternative at all. This is not an unusual arrangement in Ashwell this year. Across the country, the number of households holding more than one family, or an extra widowed parent, or a grown child who lost work in the city and came home to the family farm has climbed sharply since 1930. Families have doubled up the way ships take on ballast, quietly, out of necessity, and mostly without complaint, because the alternative to doubling up is often no roof at all. Hilda's husband worked the same mill for 31 years, a fact the two women rarely need to mention aloud since it sits quietly under every conversation they have about Walter's own hours. She arrived on Birch Lane carrying 2 trunks and a sewing machine she has had since her own wedding, and it took the better part of a year for the household to settle into a rhythm that did not chafe, an old woman and a younger one learning, slowly, where each of them could move freely in a kitchen neither had designed for 2 cooks. What eventually settled the arrangement was not a conversation but a discovery, made almost by accident, that Hilda's hand with a needle exceeded even Thelma's. Decades of practice behind stitches so fine they barely showed at all, and Thelma found she did not mind in the least being the lesser seamstress in her own house once she understood what she was gaining from the arrangement instead. Hilda taught her the coat trick, the invisible reweave Thelma performed on Walter's Sunday suit this very morning, passed down the same way most of this world's real skills get passed down, hand over hand at a kitchen table with no ceremony attached to it at all. 5 people then, in a house with 4 rooms downstairs and 2 up. Thelma runs it the way a foreman runs a small shop floor, though nobody in her life would ever describe it using that word, least of all Thelma herself, who has been taught since girlhood that what she does all day is not work in the way her husband's work is work. It has no wage attached to it. It shows up in no ledger anywhere outside the small paper notebook she keeps in the kitchen drawer. And yet it is the reason the household survives on Walter's cut hours at all. A fact that everyone in the house benefits from and almost nobody in the house has ever said out loud. Here is a detail that makes her more than a type, more than a photograph of depression virtue. Thelma reads. Not often, not for long stretches, but she keeps a library book on the shelf above the icebox, usually a novel, and she reads a chapter most nights after the children are down, standing up sometimes if her feet have had enough of sitting. This autumn it is a Kathleen Norris novel about a woman who leaves her small town for the city, and Thelma has told no one, not even Walter, how much she thinks about that ending some nights. She is not unhappy with her life. She loves her children fiercely and her husband in the settled, unglamorous way of a 10-year marriage that has survived hard years together. But she keeps one small private door open in her mind, a door marked what if, and she does not feel guilty about it, though she has never once mentioned it to another living soul. Her days are structured by a small paper notebook, the kind sold 3 for a nickel at the dry goods store, in which she keeps 2 kinds of records. One page holds the household accounts, written in pencil in a careful, upright hand, every expenditure logged down to the penny, because a family with no cushion cannot afford a single untracked cent. The other pages hold something closer to a schedule, though she would never call it that. Monday is wash day. Tuesday is ironing and mending. Wednesday she bakes and does the heavier cleaning. Thursday and Friday she is back to mending, cooking, and whatever the week has thrown at her that the earlier days did not absorb. Saturday is market day and the heaviest cooking of the week, since Sunday's dinner has to stretch into Monday's supper as well. It is not written down as law anywhere. It exists the way a river exists, cut into the landscape of the week by years of repetition until the channel simply is the shape the week takes. Today is a Wednesday in October, baking day, heavy cleaning day, and as it happens, the day the Hendricks boy is due to bring the week's coal delivery, which means Thelma will also need to be present at the house at a specific hour to see it weighed and paid for, since Walter is at the mill and Hilda's eyes are no longer sharp enough to trust with such things. It is, in other words, an ordinary Wednesday. Nothing about today is meant to be remarkable. That is exactly why it is the day worth watching. The remarkable days get written into history books. The ordinary ones are where most of a life is actually lived, and almost nobody ever thought to write them down. The stove has caught now. A small orange light flickers behind its iron door and begins, slowly, to push back against the cold kitchen air. It is 5:15, and the house around Thelma is still asleep. She kneels at the stove a moment longer, feeding in 2 more scraps of mill lumber that Walter brought home last week. Off cuts the foreman, lets the men take, rather than pay to haul away. The wood is dry, and it catches fast, and she sits back on her heels and watches the light grow through the little isinglass window in the stove door, the way she has watched it grow on some 3,000 mornings before this one. The kitchen floor is linoleum over pineboard, and even through her wool stockings it holds the whole night's cold in it. A cold that will not properly lift until nearly 7. She keeps a pair of Walter's old socks by the stove for exactly this half hour, pulled on over her own, and she pulls them on now without looking. The way you find a light switch in a room you have lived in for years. She dressed already, upstairs in the dark a few minutes before, quickly and by feel in a bedroom colder than the kitchen will be for another hour yet. Her own everyday house dress, like Alice's, began its life holding 25 pounds of flour, a plainer print than the one she chose for her daughter. Small brown diamonds on a cream ground. Since a grown woman's dress draws less notice than a child's, and Thelma has learned to spend her fabric vanity on Alice rather than herself, the dress is soft now from repeated washing. The kind of soft that only comes after 2 full seasons of wear, and it fits her the way a garment fits when it has been let out once at the seam and taken back in slightly at the waist. Adjusted twice already to a body that has had 2 children and stayed, through it all, roughly the same size it was at 19. She ties an apron over it before coming downstairs, an apron sewn from yet another sack. This one printed with small blue flowers, and by the time she reaches the kitchen, she is dressed for the entire day ahead in clothing that cost the household nothing beyond flour it needed to buy regardless. The coffee comes next, and it is not really coffee. Not entirely. Thelma stretches her coffee with roasted chicory root, a habit she picked up from her own mother and one that half the women on Birch Lane share this year, since chicory costs a fraction of what coffee does, and the two together, brewed dark in the old speckled pot, taste rich enough that Walter has never once complained about it. She measures the grounds by feel, tips in water from the kettle she keeps permanently warm on the stove's back corner, and sets the pot where the heat is steadiest. The smell that begins to fill the kitchen is bitter and warm and a little like scorched earth. And it is, this morning as every morning, the first good thing that happens in this house. While the coffee comes up, she works the cornmeal, frying it in a black skillet that belonged to Walter's mother before it belonged to her. A skillet so well seasoned by decades of use that almost nothing sticks to it anymore. An unglamorous kind of family inheritance that nobody would think to mention in a will. Cold cornmeal mush, sliced from the loaf pan where it's set overnight, goes into the hot fat in the pan and turns crisp and golden on both sides while she works, and the sound of it, a low steady sizzle, is one of the sounds she does not know she would miss if it ever stopped. There is a quiet stretch here, maybe 15 minutes before anyone else in the house stirs, and Thelma has come to treasure it in a way she has never said aloud to anyone. She sits at the kitchen table with her own cup of the chicory coffee. Black, no sugar since sugar is for the children's cereal and not for her own cup, and she looks out at nothing at all through the window over the sink where the sky outside is turning from black to the deep bruised blue that comes just before a Milltown sunrise. This is the one part of her day that belongs entirely to her. Not to Walter, not to the children, not to Hilda, not to the mill or the ledger or the wash pile or the mending basket. 15 minutes with a cup of bitter coffee and her own thoughts, and she guards this quarter hour the way another woman might guard a piece of jewelry. This morning her thoughts settle, as they often do lately, on the mill schedule pinned to the wall by the back door. 4 days this week instead of 5, a fact Walter mentioned last night in the flat voice he uses now for bad news. A voice with no anger left in it, just arithmetic. 4 days means $11 less coming into the house than a full week would bring. $11 is coal money, or most of it. She has already begun, without quite deciding to, moving numbers around in her head the way another woman might hum a tune without noticing she was doing it. By 5:30, the children's door creaks upstairs, and the quiet quarter hour ends the way it always does, without ceremony. Alice comes down first, still in her nightgown, hair every direction, and climbs straight into Thelma's lap without a word, which is a ritual so old between them that neither of them thinks of it as one anymore. Raymond follows a few minutes later, already half-dressed, buttoning his shirt wrong and not caring. Thelma fixes the buttons without comment, the same way she has fixed them 900 mornings running, and sends him to wash his face at the basin. Alice's dress for today came from a 25-pound flour sack, a small blue and white checked pattern that Thelma picked out deliberately at Kessler's back in August, choosing the sack of flour she needed anyway, based on which print would make the prettiest dress once the flour was used up and the cotton washed clean. This is not a small industry accident. The mills that pack flour and chicken feed into cotton sacking have started printing patterns on purpose these last few years, because they learned, the way businesses eventually learn everything that keeps women buying their product, that a farm wife or a mill wife choosing between 2 brands of flour will choose the one whose empty sack becomes a dress her daughter will actually want to wear. Alice's dress has small cap sleeves and a sash Thelma sewed from a scrap of ribbon saved from a hat box 2 Christmases back, and if you did not know to look for the telltale seam where the sack's original stitching once ran, you would never guess this dress began its life holding 25 pounds of flour. Now, here is where most people get this wrong. When they picture a house like this one, they picture shame in that flour sack dress, a family too poor to do better, a small girl in second-hand rags. Alice does not experience it that way, and neither, watching her, does Thelma. The dress is pretty. Thelma chose the print with real care, the way any mother might choose fabric at a proper dress shop if she had that kind of money to spend. The competence involved in turning a feed sack into something a 6-year-old is proud to wear, the eye for pattern, the patience of the stitching, the small vanity of the ribbon sash is not a symptom of poverty. It is a skill, practiced and real, and Thelma takes a quiet private satisfaction in it that has nothing to do with pity and everything to do with craft. Hilda comes down last, moving carefully on the stairs the way she has moved since a fall 2 winters back left her hips stiff in cold weather, and takes her seat at the table with the quiet economy of an old woman who has learned exactly how much energy a morning requires and spends no more than that. She and Thelma have an easy morning rhythm by now. 3 years of living in the same small kitchen, having worn away whatever friction existed at the start. Hilda pours her own coffee, cuts bread for herself, and begins darning a sock she picked up last night, working by the growing daylight at the window rather than waste a lamp wick this early. Walter comes down, dressed for the mill, his work trousers stiff with the cold of the unheated bedroom he dressed in, and eats his mush and eggs standing at the counter rather than sitting, a habit from years of catching an early shift that he has never quite unlearned even on the days he starts later. Thelma packs his lunch pail while he eats, working from memory and habit rather than thought. 2 lard biscuits split and buttered thin, a boiled egg, and a cold roast apple left from last week's baking, wrapped in a clean flour sackcloth and set into the round tin pail with the practiced speed of a woman who has packed this same pail perhaps 2,000 times. Walter kisses the top of Alice's head, tells Raymond to mind his mother, and is out the door into the last of the dark before 6, walking the 11 minutes it takes to reach the mill gate on foot. Since the household has not owned a car since 1930, and Walter has never once complained about the walk. Not in front of the children, anyway. The house is quieter now. Raymond finishes his mush at the table, feet swinging under his chair, already thinking about the marbles he has hidden in his coat pocket, rather than about the arithmetic waiting for him at school. Alice sits close against Thelma's side while her hair gets braided, a task that takes 4 minutes and that Thelma performs the same way every single morning. 3 strands, tight enough to last the school day, finished with a bit of ribbon that matches nothing in particular and everyone in the household has agreed not to mention. By 7 the children are dressed, fed, and out the door toward the schoolhouse 4 blocks over, Raymond walking ahead the way 9-year-old boys always seem to feel they must, Alice trailing behind with her rag doll tucked under one arm because she refuses, on principle, to leave the house without it. They fall in along the way with the Pruitt children from 2 streets over, and the 4 of them make the walk together most mornings, kicking through drifts of fallen leaves along the gutter, arguing amiably over whose turn it is to carry a stick they have adopted for no reason anyone could explain. Cutting behind the Lutheran church rather than around it because the shortcut saves exactly 90 seconds, and 90 seconds matters enormously to children convinced they are always 1 step from being late. Raymond will trade half his lard biscuit to Frankie Pruitt before the morning is out, a transaction neither mother will ever hear about. And Alice will spend the walk narrating a story to her rag doll in a low, private voice that trails off entirely the moment another child gets close enough to overhear. Thelma stands in the doorway a moment and watches them go, the cold air raising gooseflesh on her arms, and then she turns back into the kitchen, where the morning's real work, the work that has no whistle to mark its start or its finish, is only just beginning. Before any of that, though, there is the ice card to see to. Thelma keeps a small square card propped in the front window, printed with 4 numbers around its edges, 25, 50, 75, and 100, and each evening she turns it so whichever number faces the street tells the iceman how many pounds to leave the following morning. The iceman's wagon comes creaking up Birch Lane a few minutes past 7, drawn by a heavier horse than the Hendricks boys' coal animal, and the iceman himself, a broad, quiet man named Gorski, who has covered this route for as long as anyone on the street can remember, carries the block in with a pair of steel tongs and a leather pad slung over one shoulder to keep the melt from soaking through his shirt. He sets today's 25-pound block into the icebox on the back porch without a word needed between them, since the routine has worn itself smooth over years of repetition, and Thelma pays him from a separate small tin kept just for this purpose, since ice, unlike coal, is a weekly rather than a seasonal expense and gets tracked on its own line in her ledger. A handful of children trail the wagon most mornings, chasing whatever ice chips fall loose from the block as Gorski carries it. A small free pleasure that costs the household nothing, and that Thelma has never once discouraged, remembering well enough what it felt like to be a child chasing something cold and sweet on a chilly morning. It is 7:45. The dishes from breakfast wait in the basin. The stove needs feeding again. And somewhere in the mending basket by the window, 3 of Walter's work shirts are waiting for her attention, their collars worn through on the inside edge where they rub against a man's neck all day, every day, week after week, until the fabric simply gives up. Now, the economics of this world deserve their own unhurried explanation, because everything we have watched Thelma do this morning only makes sense once you understand the arithmetic she is doing without ever writing most of it down. Let us start with what actually comes into the Voss household. Walter's rolling mill wage runs close to 62 cents an hour, which sounds respectable set beside a bricklayer or a bank clerk of the same era, and in a full week of 5 8-hour days would bring home nearly $25. But full weeks are the exception this year, not the rule. The mill's owners, sitting in an office in Pittsburgh that none of them has ever driven out to see, decided years back that spreading reduced work across the whole payroll was preferable to laying off a third of the men outright, a policy that keeps more families fed at a lower level rather than a few families fed well and the rest fed not at all. It is, in its way, a kind of rough mercy. It is also the reason Walter brought home closer to $11 last week instead of $25. Set against that income, the fixed costs of the household do not bend. Rent on the Birch Lane house runs $18 a month, a sum owed whether the mill runs 4 days or none. Coal for the coming winter, bought now while the price sits near $10 a ton rather than in January when scarcity drives it higher. Needs to be paid for in a lump the household frankly cannot always produce in a lump. Which is why Thelma has been setting aside whatever she can from the grocery money since August, $1 here, 70 cents there, toward a coal fund that lives in a coffee tin on the top pantry shelf. Add in food for 5 people at 8 cents a loaf of bread, 30 cents a dozen eggs, and something near a dime for milk, and the arithmetic of a month in this house leaves almost nothing that could honestly be called margin. This is where Thelma's unpaid labor stops being background detail and becomes, in plain terms, the second income the household actually runs on. Consider the flour sack dress. A child's dress bought ready-made at a dry goods store this year runs somewhere between 75 cents and $1.25, depending on the fabric and the trim. Thelma's flour sack, on the other hand, cost the household nothing beyond the flour it already needed to buy, since the sacking is simply what the flour arrives packed inside. The dress that emerges from it, sewn over perhaps 3 evenings by lamplight, therefore represents close to $1 of value the family never had to spend, created entirely by hours of Thelma's labor that appear on no wage ledger anywhere in the country. Multiply that single dress by every mended sock, every turned shirt collar, every jar of soup stretched from bacon rinds and vegetable trimmings that would otherwise have gone to the hogs, every bar of soap boiled up from saved fat rather than bought at Kessler's for a dime, and you start to see the shape of something economists of this era have only just begun trying to measure. A few researchers, working through the 20s and now into the 30s, have attempted rough estimates of what a housewife's labor would cost if a family had to purchase it on the open market instead, hiring a cook, a laundress, a seamstress, and a nurse separately. Their figures vary, but they consistently land somewhere in the range of what a skilled tradesman earns in a year. Thelma has never heard of these studies and would likely find the whole exercise faintly absurd. But the number would not surprise her, because she already knows, in the way you know a thing in your hands rather than in your head, exactly how much the household would lose if she were not here to do it. Clothing itself moves through this economy in ways that would strike a modern household as strange. Raymond's Sunday trousers were Frankie Pruitt's Sunday trousers 2 years ago, handed down through a quiet network of mothers who keep informal track of whose child is growing out of what, and whose child is about to grow into it. Nothing about this arrangement carries shame between the women involved, since every family on Birch Lane both gives and receives along this same chain at different points in a child's growth, and Thelma has already set aside a coat of Raymond's, grown too short in the sleeve, for the Pruitt's younger boy once the weather turns cold enough to need it. A garment in this economy is never finished being useful just because one child has outgrown it. It simply moves to whichever child fits it next, mend it again if it needs mending, until there is truly nothing left of the original fabric worth saving, at which point it becomes a quilt patch, a cleaning rag, or kindling paper, and even then some small use gets wrung from it before it is finally allowed to disappear. It helps to see this household's numbers set against the wider country, because the Vosses are not an unusual case. They are, in almost every respect, the ordinary case. 5 years earlier, in 1929, an American family living on wages like Walter's might have brought home somewhere near $2,300 across a full year, a figure that already assumed steady full-time work rather than any guarantee of it. By the depth of the collapse in 1932 and 1933, that same family's income had fallen by nearly a third nationally, and the recovery, underway in 1934, real but slow, has clawed back only a portion of what was lost. Ashwell's rolling mill, running at half capacity with its men on partial weeks, mirrors almost exactly what is happening in mill towns and factory towns from Pennsylvania to Illinois this same autumn. Thelma's $11 week is not a story about one family's own bad luck. It is a story about an entire national wage structure that has been cut nearly in half and has not yet found its way back. There is more to understand here, and it has to do with what happens when a household like Thelma and Walter's cannot make the arithmetic balance on its own. The federal government, through an agency called the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, has been channeling money to states since 1933 for exactly this purpose, and Ashwell's relief office, 3 doors down from the pharmacy, sees a steady trickle of families whose mill hours have been cut past the point where flour sacks and bacon rind soup can close the gap. Accepting that relief carries a weight in a town like this one that is worth being honest about. It is not shame exactly, not for most families, but it sits close to shame's neighborhood, a visit to the relief office being the kind of thing a family does quietly and mentions to almost no one. Thelma and Walter have not needed to make that visit, not yet, and the effort Thelma pours into stretching $11 as far as it will go is, among other things, an effort to keep it that way for as long as she possibly can. For Thelma, none of this arithmetic feels like sacrifice in the way an outside observer might assume. It feels like competence. It feels like the one area of her life where her judgment, her hands, and her hours produce a visible, countable result, even if the count never appears on any government ledger or bank statement anywhere. The household stands upright on wages that, by themselves, should not be enough to hold it upright. The reason it stands is standing in the kitchen right now, wringing out a dish towel and already thinking about the mending basket. It is nearly 8 o'clock. The morning's first work is finished. The morning's real work has only begun. The dishes take 20 minutes, washed in water still hot from the kettle, dried with a flour sack towel gone soft from 100 washings, and put away in a cupboard whose shelf paper Thelma replaced back in the spring using a page torn from a seed catalogue, since proper shelf paper costs money she would rather spend elsewhere. With the dishes done, she turns to the bread. Wednesday is baking day, and the kitchen table gets cleared and floured for it, a wide bare surface where 4 loaves worth of dough will be worked by hand over the next half hour. Thelma keeps a covered crock of starter going year-round on the pantry shelf, fed with a little flour and water every few days, since buying fresh yeast cakes at Kessler's is another small cost a household in her position has learnt to avoid, where a bit of ongoing attention will do the same job for free. She works the dough the way her own mother taught her on the farm. Heel of the hand pressed in, quarter turn, fold, heel of the hand again. A rhythm so old in her muscles that her mind is free to wander while her hands do the entire job without supervision. This morning, her mind wanders to Raymond's shoes, which have gone tight across the toe in the last month, in the alarming way a boy's feet do right before a growth spurt, and to the fact that new shoes for a 9-year-old run close to $1.50, a sum that does not currently exist anywhere in the coffee tin. It is 9:15 when the coal wagon comes up Birch Lane, The Hendricks boy driving the same sway-backed horse his father has used for coal deliveries as long as Thelma has lived on this street. He cannot be more than 16, all elbows and a coal-dust complexion that will not fully wash off until Saturday, and he brings the wagon around back to where the coal chute sits beside the cellar window. Thelma comes out in her apron, arms crossed against the cold, and stands by while he shovels the load into the chute, counting the shovelfuls under her breath the way she has learnt to do since a dealer 2 streets over was caught, last winter, shorting 3 families running on their weight. The Hendricks boy does not shortchange anyone, and both of them know she is not really watching him so much as watching the scale ticket he hands her afterward. Comparing the weight written there against her own rough count. It is not an accusation. It is simply the arithmetic of a household with no room in it for being cheated even honestly, by $1 here or there. She pays him from the coffee tin, counts his change twice out of habit rather than suspicion, and sends him off with a slice of bread still warm enough to steam a little in the cold air, a small kindness that costs her almost nothing, and that the boy, judging by his face, does not get offered on every stop along his route. While the dough rises under its towel, Thelma turns to the heavy cleaning that Wednesday always demands, the kind of work that does not fit into any other day of her week. She rolls the parlor rug and drags it out to the porch rail, beating it with the wire paddle Walter fashioned for her out of an old fence wire 2 summers back, and the dust that rises off it in grey clouds tells her, as it always does, that the rug needed this more than she remembered. Back inside, she scrubs the kitchen floor on her knees with a stiff brush and a pail of water gone grey almost the moment it touches the linoleum, working backward toward the door so she never has to step across a section she has already cleaned. The windows get vinegar water and a wad of yesterday's newspaper, which she has learned leaves less lint than any rag and cuts through the film of coal soot that settles on every pane of glass in Ashwell within a week of washing, whether anyone in the house has done anything at all to cause it. The stove itself gets its own treatment today, since a cold enough morning to need blacking comes only once a week or so. Thelma works a paste of stove black into the cooled iron with a stiff brush, buffing it afterward with a soft cloth until the surface takes on a dull, healthy shine, a small vanity applied to an object nobody outside the family will ever see closely enough to admire. Blacking the stove protects the iron from rust as much as it improves its looks, and Thelma has long since stopped separating those 2 purposes in her mind, since, in a household like this one, a thing done properly is almost always a thing that serves more than one purpose at once. By the time she straightens up from the stove, her knees ache in the dull, familiar way that Wednesdays always leave them, and she allows herself 30 seconds standing at the window before turning back to the rest of the morning. By 10, the bread is rising under a clean towel near the stove's warmth, and Thelma allows herself the first sitting down stretch of her day. She carries the mending basket to the front room, where a chair sits angled to catch the low autumn sun through the window, and settles in with the wooden darning egg that belonged, like the skillet, to somebody in the family before her. Hilda joins her there most mornings, the 2 women working in a silence that is comfortable rather than empty, needles moving, the low static hiss of the radio warming up in the corner, though nothing is playing on it yet, this early in the day. The darning itself is a skill most people watching from the outside would never think to call a skill at all. And this is one of those details that changes the picture entirely once you actually watch it done. Thelma slides the wooden egg inside the heel of Raymond's sock, stretching the worn fabric taut over its smooth curved surface, and begins weaving new thread across the hole in a pattern that crosses first one direction and then the other, over and under, until the gap is filled with something closer to a small woven patch than a repair. Done well, a darned heel will outlast the rest of the sock. Done poorly, it puckers and rubs and creates new blisters faster than the original hole ever did. Thelma does it well, has done it well, for a decade, and there is something in the slow rhythm of it, thread crossing thread in the sunlight, that settles her mind the same way her 15 minutes alone with the coffee pot settled it at dawn. Beside the socks sits one of Walter's work shirts, its collar frayed through on the inside edge where it has rubbed his neck raw all week. This is where the real skill shows itself. Thelma unpicks the collar entirely, seam by careful seam, using a small pair of scissors kept just for this purpose, and turns the whole piece inside out, so that the good, unworn side of the fabric now faces outward and the frayed side sits hidden against the shirt's body. She resews it by hand, small even stitches that will hold through another full season of millwork, and when she is finished the shirt looks, from any distance greater than a few inches, like a shirt with a perfectly sound collar. It is not new. It is not even really repaired, in the sense of returning to its original state. It is something closer to reinvented, given a second working life through nothing but patience and a skill that took her years as a young wife to learn properly. There is one more piece in the basket this morning that calls for the finest skill Thelma owns, and it belongs to Walter's good wool suit coat, worn only to church and funerals, which has torn a small gash along the elbow where the fabric finally gave way to years of wear. A patch here would show, and a suit that shows its mending loses exactly the kind of quiet respectability the family works so hard to maintain on Sundays. So Thelma does something closer to surgery than sewing. She picks a few threads loose from the coat's own inside him, fabric nobody will ever see, and uses them to reweave the tear itself, crossing thread through thread in a pattern that borrows the coat's own weave rather than laying a foreign patch across it. It takes the better part of an hour for a tear 4 inches long, work fine enough that it strains her eyes even in good window light, and when she is finished, you would need to hold the coat an inch from your nose in full sun to find where the damage ever was. This is the actual meaning of invisible mending, not a figure of speech, but a literal outcome, achieved through patience most people today would not think to spend on a garment at all. Now, here is where most people get this wrong. Imagining mornings like this one. They picture drudgery, a woman bent unhappily over endless mending because she has no other choice. There is truth in the no other choice part of that picture, certainly, but sit with Thelma an hour in that chair, watching her hands, and you notice something the flat photograph never captures. There is a real, unhurried satisfaction in this work, the same kind a craftsman feels finishing a joint that fits clean, or a cook feels when a sauce finally comes together the way she intended. The mending is not a punishment Thelma endures. It is a set of small, exact problems that she solves, one after another, with her own 2 hands, and solving them well is one of the few places in her week where the results are entirely visible and entirely hers. At 11 the soup goes on properly, though its foundation has been simmering low on the back of the stove since yesterday. Thelma has been saving bacon ends in a covered dish in the icebox for the better part of 2 weeks, along with the outer leaves of cabbage most cooks throw away, the woody ends of carrots, an onion gone slightly soft that would otherwise be wasted. All of it goes into the big pot with water and a bay leaf saved from last Christmas, and by the time it has simmered through the afternoon, it will have become something rich and warming that will feed the family for 2 full days, stretched further each time with a few more potatoes or a handful of barley. Nothing in this kitchen is wasted if there is any possible way to prevent it, and the soup pot is where that principle finds its clearest daily expression. While the soup works, Thelma turns to the lye soap she started 3 days ago, saved fat rendered down and mixed with lye bought at the hardware store, poured into a wooden mold lined with waxed paper and left to cure on the cellar shelf. She checks it now, testing the surface with a careful finger, and finds it firm enough to cut into bars, a task she performs with an old kitchen knife kept just for this purpose, since lye residue is not something you want anywhere near food. Store-bought soap runs close to $0.10 a bar at Kessler's. This batch, made from fat that would otherwise have been thrown out, costs the household almost nothing beyond the lye itself, and there is again a real competence in getting the proportions right. Too little lye and the soap stays soft and useless. Too much, and it burns the skin it is meant to clean. Mrs. Halloran from 2 doors down stops by a little after noon with a jar of the applesauce the radio-fixing boy traded his labor for, and the two women stand in the kitchen doorway a few minutes trading news the way neighbors do. Careful, in the way most conversations on this street are careful this year, to keep the talk to children and weather and church rather than to husband's hours or grocery bills, subjects that sit too close to the bone to discuss even between friends. Mrs. Halloran mentions that her own boy has had a cough for a week that will not clear, and Thelma's mind goes, involuntarily, to Alice's chest, which rattled faintly for 2 nights back in September before settling on its own. An episode that frightened her more than she let on to Walter at the time, since there is no family doctor on retainer in a house like this one, and a serious illness could undo a month of careful saving in a single visit. By 12:30, Thelma and Hilda share a bowl of yesterday's soup at the kitchen table, plain bread from the batch, now baked and cooling on the sill, and a few minutes of actual conversation between two women who have learned, over 3 years under one roof, when silence serves them better than talk, and when it does not. Hilda asks after Raymond's shoes, having noticed the same tightness Thelma noticed, and the two of them work through the arithmetic together the way they work through most household problems, out loud, practical, without drama. Perhaps the winter coat Raymond wore 2 years ago can be let down at the hem and cut into something for Alice, freeing a little money elsewhere. Perhaps the shoes wait 1 more month. Nothing gets decided outright. It simply gets turned over, the way dough gets turned over, until it starts to take a shape that will hold. The afternoon light through the kitchen window has shifted by 1 o'clock, sliding lower and turning the deep gold color it only takes on in October, and Thelma glances at the clock on the mantel with the small private satisfaction of a woman who has, once again, made an impossible morning add up to something that works. The bread is baked. The soup is rich and ready. The soap is cut and curing. Walter's collar is turned, Raymond's sock is darned, and the coal is paid for and safely in the cellar bin. None of it will show up anywhere outside this house. All of it is the entire reason this house continues to stand. Outside, the wind has picked up, carrying the first dry leaves down Birch Lane in small scattered handfuls, and somewhere down the block a screen door bangs twice against its frame. The afternoon still has hours of work left in it, wash to bring in from yesterday's line, potatoes to peel before supper, and the familiar hush that settles over Ashwell in the hour before the school children come pouring back out into the streets. This is one of those moments where a small detail tells a bigger story, and the detail worth pausing on here is Mrs. Halloran's cough remark and the small private fear it stirred in Thelma. Because behind that ordinary neighborly exchange sits an entire world of rules, obligations, and quiet dread that shaped every hour of a woman's life in 1934, and it deserves its own honest look. Start with health, since health is where the fear lives closest to the surface. There is no family doctor on retainer in the Voss household, and there is no such thing as health insurance in the way we would recognize it today. A doctor's house call in a town like Ashwell runs somewhere between $2 and $3, a sum that, set against Walter's $11 week, represents a genuine crisis rather than a minor expense. This is why Thelma's mind went straight to dread rather than mild concern when Alice's chest rattled back in September. Diphtheria, scarlet fever, and whooping cough are not distant historical footnotes to a mother in 1934. They are neighborhood facts, diseases that still take children in towns exactly like this one most years, and every mother on Birch Lane has learned to read a cough the way a sailor reads weather, watching for the signs that separate an ordinary autumn chill from something that will need money the family does not have. The response to that fear is a whole home medical practice most families keep entirely inside their own walls. A mustard plaster for a chest cold, made from dry mustard mixed into a paste and spread on a cloth against the skin, uncomfortable but genuinely effective at loosening a congested chest. Camphorated oil rubbed on before bed. Castor oil for nearly everything else, dosed out with the same grim ritual in households across the country. children pinching their noses against the taste while their mothers stand over them, unmoved by the protest. Thelma remembers, without much fondness, the week 2 winters back when Raymond's chest went bad enough that she sat up with him 3 nights running, a mustard plaster applied and reapplied. A kettle kept boiling on the stove so the whole kitchen filled with steam he could breathe. And Walter pacing the hall outside the bedroom door in a way he would never have admitted to being frightened, though frightened is exactly what he was. The doctor came once that week, a visit that cost the household $2 it did not comfortably have to spend, and told them only what Thelma already suspected, that the boy needed steam, rest and time, and that there was little more to be done beyond what she was already doing. Raymond recovered. He always recovers, so far, and Thelma has learned not to take that so far for granted, since she has stood at more than one neighbour's door this same decade, with a covered dish in her hands, offering the only comfort available to a family that a smaller coffin has just left. Most births on Birch Lane still happen at home as well, attended by a midwife, or, for families who can manage the cost, the doctor who runs the small practice above the pharmacy downtown. Infant death remains far more common than it will become within a single generation from now, and every mother in Ashwell carries that knowledge quietly, without needing to say it aloud to another living soul. Set beside this fear is something that might surprise you, which is how seriously the era treated domestic competence as an actual teachable discipline. The word housework suggests something informal, learned by accident at a mother's elbow. But by 1934, home economics has been a proper school subject for more than 2 decades, taught to girls at Ashwell's own schoolhouse from a real textbook, with real experts behind it, women like Ellen Richards, who helped found the field, and the United States Department of Agriculture's own Extension Service, which mails pamphlets on nutrition, budgeting and food preservation to farm and small-town wives across the entire country. Raymond studies arithmetic and civics this year. His classmate Dorothy, 2 years older, studies those same subjects alongside a formal course in meal planning, fabric selection, and household budgeting, complete with graded assignments and an actual textbook with Thelma's own approach to flour sack dresses described, almost word for word, as recommended practice. Now, here is where most people get this wrong, picturing a housewife's skill as something inherited casually and practiced without structure. The reality is closer to a genuinely codified body of knowledge, developed by professional home economists, taught in public schools, reinforced by government pamphlets, and passed down through a curriculum nearly as formal as the one that teaches boys a trade. Thelma herself sat through 2 years of exactly this instruction in her own girlhood, before her father lost the farm, and much of what she does without thinking each morning traces directly back to lessons delivered from a chalkboard by a teacher named Miss Anders, whom Thelma still remembers fondly and has not seen in a decade. Layered over both health and education sits the social architecture of the town itself, which sorts families with a precision nobody writes down, but everybody understands. Church attendance functions as a kind of unofficial ledger of respectability. The Ladies' Aid Society at the Lutheran Church, which Thelma attends most Sundays with Hilda and the children while Walter, not much of a churchgoer, uses the morning to split wood, distributes small charity where it is needed, a basket of vegetables here, a set of outgrown children's clothes there, always managed with enough discretion that the receiving family need not feel it as pity. A well-kept house, well-mended children's clothes, and a reputation for managing hard times without complaint all register, whether anyone says so directly. As evidence of a family's standing, evidence that matters enormously to men like Walter, whose actual wages have become, through no fault of their own, an unreliable measure of anything at all. The Ladies' Aid does more than distribute charity quietly. It trains the next generation of women in the very competence this whole world runs on. often before those girls are old enough to fully understand what they are being trained for. Thelma has already started teaching Alice simple stitches on scraps of leftover fabric, a running stitch first, then a back stitch, small lessons folded into an afternoon the way Thelma's own mother once folded them into hers, so that by the time Alice reaches Dorothy Pruitt's age and sits down to her own formal course in the schoolhouse, the needle will already feel like an old friend in her hand rather than a stranger. Last spring, the Aid Society gathered for 2 full Saturdays, sewing baby clothes for families expecting children with less than the Vosses have. A dozen women around 2 borrowed sewing machines and a great many more hands working entirely by needle, trading patterns and small tricks of the trade across the table the whole while. Alice sat under that table for most of both Saturdays, listening the way she listens to her mother in the kitchen, absorbing a curriculum nobody called a curriculum at all. There is more to understand here about the shape of Ashwell's social hierarchy specifically, because it is not a simple ladder with the mill owner at the top and the relief families at the bottom. It is closer to a set of overlapping circles. Mill families like the Vosses occupy one circle defined by wages tied directly to the mill's fortunes. Shopkeeper families like the Kesslers occupy another, more insulated from a single bad month, but no less anxious about the whole town's economy, since a mill that cannot pay its men cannot buy bread either. Farm families on the edge of town occupy a third circle entirely, poorer in cash, but often richer in food, trading eggs and produce into the very network of favours that keeps women like Thelma and Mrs. Halloran afloat. Nobody in Ashwell would draw this map out loud. Everybody in Ashwell navigates it every single day, without needing to. For Thelma, all of this settles into something closer to a code of conduct than a set of facts. She manages her children's health with the tools her mother gave her and the pamphlets the extension office mails free of charge. She practices a discipline that was, quite literally, graded in a classroom before she ever kept house of her own. And she performs her family's respectability, however unconsciously, every time she sends Alice out the door in a carefully chosen flour sack print rather than something dingy or torn. Because in a town where cash has stopped being a reliable measure of anything, appearance has become one of the few measures left that a family can still control. It is nearing 2 o'clock now. The bread has cooled on the sill. The soup has thickened on the stove. And somewhere down Birch Lane, the schoolhouse bell is about to ring the children back out into an afternoon that is already beginning to cool. Thelma spends the next hour on the wash, which has been drying since yesterday afternoon, on the line strung between the house and the leaning cedar post at the back of the yard. The sheets have gone stiff overnight in the falling temperature, frozen nearly flat before the sun climbed high enough to soften them again, and she works down the line unpinning each piece, the wooden clothespins creaking as she twists them loose, cold enough against her fingers that she has to stop twice and warm her hands under her arms before continuing. The linens smell of cold air and sun, a clean mineral smell with nothing false or manufactured in it, and she buries her face in the first folded sheet for a moment before carrying the basket in, a small private pleasure that costs nothing and that she allows herself without a second thought. Once the wash is folded and put away, she turns to Walter's good shoes and her own, the ones worn to church and nowhere else, laid out on newspaper on the kitchen table. She works mutton tallow into the leather with an old rag, working it in slow circles until the leather drinks the fat down and turns supple again. A treatment that will keep the winters coming slush and salt from cracking the seams the way plain neglect would. It is not glamorous work. It leaves a faint, greasy smell on her hands that will not fully wash out until supper. But good shoes, properly kept, last 3 winters instead of 1, and 3 winters of shoes is not a small thing to a household counting every dollar the way this one does. By 3:30, the front door bangs open and Raymond comes through it first, already talking before he is fully inside, full of some scheme involving a jar of marbles and a boy named Frankie Pruitt. Alice follows more quietly a moment later, cheeks pink from the cold, ragdoll still tucked under one arm exactly where it was that morning. Both children know, without being told, that the potatoes for supper are waiting to be peeled, and both settle at the kitchen table with paring knives blunt enough not to worry Thelma, working through the pile while Raymond narrates the entire school day in more detail than anyone strictly requires. This is one of the small unspoken deals of the household. Children help, not because anyone made a speech about responsibility, but because a family running on $11 a week has no room for hands that sit idle while there is work in front of them, and Thelma has never once needed to explain why. The radio, which has been humming its low warm static in the front room since morning, gets switched properly on around 4, and the sound that comes through the speaker, tinny and a little uneven, becomes the background against which the rest of the afternoon unfolds. An announcer's voice, distant and formal, gives way to music, and somewhere in the house Hilda hums along under her breath without seeming to notice she is doing it. The wind outside has picked up further, rattling the last dry leaves along the fence line, and the light through the front window has gone the low gold colour that belongs only to an autumn late afternoon, sliding toward the blue of evening a little earlier each week as the season turns. Walter comes through the door a few minutes past 5, later than his usual shift end, because the foreman kept 2 men back to finish a job that could not wait for tomorrow, and Thelma reads the tiredness in his shoulders the moment he crosses the threshold. A kind of tiredness that has become ordinary enough this year that she no longer asks about it directly. He washes at the basin, changes out of his work shirt into the one Thelma turned just this week, and sits at the table while she serves the soup, thick now and rich, with 2 days of slow cooking behind it, alongside the last of the morning's bread. Conversation at supper stays light on purpose. Raymond's marbles. Alice's rag doll, which apparently had adventures of its own today involving a missing button. Hilda's opinion on the radio program from the afternoon. Nobody at this table brings up the mill schedule, or the coal tin, or the shoes Raymond will need before winter fully arrives. Because supper is one of the few hours in the day the family has agreed, without ever discussing it, to protect from that weight. Walter asks Raymond, as he asks most nights, to name one true thing and one made-up thing that happened at school, a small game he invented years back that Raymond still takes seriously enough to think hard before answering. Tonight's true thing is Frankie Pruitt losing a shoe in the schoolyard mud. Tonight's made-up thing, delivered with a completely straight face, involves a teacher who can supposedly turn into a bird on Fridays, and Walter considers this claim with the same grave attention he would give a genuine piece of news, asking a single serious follow-up question about what kind of bird, which sends Raymond into a fit of laughter that Alice joins without entirely understanding why. Hilda, watching the two of them from across the table, catches Thelma's eye for just a moment, and something passes between the two women that needs no words at all. A shared recognition that whatever the mill takes from this family in wages, it has not managed to take this. After supper the dishes get cleared quickly. Raymond and Alice both excused to the front room the moment their plates are empty, and the household gathers there the way it does most evenings, drawn by nothing more complicated than the warm circle of lamplight and the low glow of the radio's vacuum tubes behind their little window of glass. Walter takes the chair nearest the stove, tired enough tonight that he sits mostly in silence, listening to Amos and Andy come through the speaker in their familiar back and forth, voices the whole family could probably recite from memory if pressed. Raymond laughs loudest at a line about a broken-down taxicab that he does not fully understand, mostly because his father is laughing. And Walter's laugh, low and a little rusty from a day spent mostly not talking at all, is a sound Thelma finds herself listening for more than she listens for the program itself. Alice does not follow the jokes at all, but she likes the voices, and she has taken to humming along under the theme music in a way that makes no musical sense whatsoever and that nobody in the room has the heart to correct. Hilda knits in the chair by the window, her needles clicking in a rhythm as steady as the darning egg was this morning, and Thelma sits with the mending basket balanced on her knees, working through one more sock by lamplight since the day's supply of daylight ran out well before the day's supply of mending did. Not every evening in this front room sounds like tonight's. When President Roosevelt speaks to the country over the radio, which he has taken to doing every few months since taking office, the whole household gathers with a different kind of attention. Hilda setting her knitting down entirely, Walter leaning forward in his chair rather than sitting back in it. There is something in that calm, unhurried voice coming out of the speaker, addressing the nation as though it were a room full of neighbors rather than a crowd of strangers. That steadies a house like this one in a way the comedy programs never quite manage. Thelma could not repeat back the details of banking policy or relief appropriations discussed in the last such broadcast, but she remembers exactly how it felt to sit in this same chair and hear a man in Washington speak as though families like hers were the whole reason the government existed at all, rather than an afterthought to it. Tonight is not one of those nights. Tonight is simply Amos and Andy and a tired husband's rusty laugh, which is its own kind of steadying, quieter and smaller, but no less real for being ordinary. This is the part of the day when the correction to the common picture matters most, because most people picture the Depression evening as grim, silent, a family enduring hardship with grim faces around a bare table. What is actually happening in this front room is something closer to contentment, hard-won and specific to its circumstances, but real. The radio program ends and another begins. Raymond falls half asleep against his father's arm before Walter notices and sends him up to bed. Alice, tucked against Thelma's side on the settee, asks a question about the rag doll's imagined day that Thelma answers with more patience than the hour probably deserves. Nobody in this room would tell you they are suffering tonight. They would tell you, if you asked, that it has been a long week and the mill hours are worrying and the winter ahead looks hard. And then, in the same breath, that this hour by the stove is a good one. Because it is. By 8 the children are in bed, tucked under a heavy patchwork quilt that Hilda pieced together 2 winters back from scraps of an old wool coat too worn to wear, but far too good, in a household like this one, to simply throw away. Thelma sits with them a few minutes each, as she does most nights, smoothing Alice's hair back from her forehead and listening to Raymond's half-formed questions about whether the mill will keep running through the winter. Questions she answers honestly but gently, telling him the truth in a size he can actually hold without frightening him past what a 9-year-old should have to carry. Downstairs, Hilda finishes her row and folds her knitting away by 9, offering a quiet good night before climbing the stairs slowly. One hand on the rail, Walter stays a while longer with the radio turned low, listening to a late program out of Cleveland, the tiredness in his shoulders finally starting to ease now that the day's shift is behind him and tomorrow's is not yet close enough to worry about. Thelma finishes the last sock in the mending basket, biting off the thread with her teeth the way her mother always warned her not to and did herself anyway, and sits a moment longer in the lamplight beside her husband, neither of them needing to say much of anything at all. It has been, by any honest measure, an ordinary Wednesday. Nothing about it will be remembered by history, and nothing about it was meant to be. And yet the day is not quite finished. There is still the fire to bank, the notebook to close out, and the exact hour when a house like this one finally goes fully quiet, and we will return to all of that before the night is through. Before we do, there is something about this exact stretch of history worth understanding, because change was already moving beneath the surface of that quiet front room, even though nobody sitting in it that night could have named it yet. Thelma has no way of knowing, listening to the radio with her husband in October of 1934, that the government program keeping her town's relief office running, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, has less than a year left before it gets replaced entirely by something larger and more permanent. Within a year, a new system of federal old age insurance will be signed into law, the beginning of what will eventually become Social Security, a program built in direct response to exactly the kind of precarious old age Hilda represents, a widow with no pension worth mentioning and nowhere to go but her son's spare room. Thelma will never think of Hilda's presence in her household as a problem that policy ought to solve. But policy, slowly and imperfectly, is already being built to make the next generation of widows less dependent on whichever son happens to have a spare room and a wife willing to share her kitchen. Nor does Thelma know that the very symbol hanging in Kessler's window, the blue eagle of the National Recovery Administration, will not survive to see another autumn. Within the year, the Supreme Court will strike the whole program down, ruling that the federal government overreached in trying to set codes of fair competition and minimum wages by executive fiat. The fine points of that ruling will mean little to a woman in Ashwell beyond the fact that the placard eventually comes out of the pharmacy window and is never replaced. But the underlying question the ruling raised, how much power the federal government ought to have over wages, hours, and the basic conditions of a working man's life, will not go away with the eagle. It will return, reshaped, again and again for the rest of the decade and well beyond it. Closer to home, and closer to Walter specifically, something is stirring inside the mills themselves that will matter to this family more directly than any court ruling in Washington. The steelworkers of this country have organized in scattered, often fragile ways for decades, but the years just ahead will bring something sturdier. A new industrial union movement is about to split off from the older craft unions and begin organizing entire mills, rather than just the skilled trades within them, catchers and rollers and laborers all together rather than separated by rank the way the old craft unions preferred. It will take years, and in more than one American steel town, it will take violence before it takes hold. But by the time Raymond is a grown man working the same kind of mill floor his father works tonight, the wage he earns and the say he has in his own working hours will owe something real to organizing that has not yet properly begun on the night we are watching. Walter himself will live to see some of this. Within 3 years, he will attend his first union meeting, held quietly in the back room of a tavern 2 streets from the mill gate. More curious than committed at first, a man testing whether this new movement is worth the risk to a job he cannot afford to lose. He will not become a leader of anything. He is not that kind of man, and he would be the first to say so. But he will sign a card, attend the meetings that fit around his shift, and vote. When the day finally comes to vote for a contract that guarantees something his own father's generation of mill hands never had, a say, however small, in how many days a week the mill has the right to send him home without pay. None of this exists yet tonight. Tonight there is only the flat arithmetic of $11, and a man too tired to do anything with his evening but listen to the radio. There is more to understand here about the children upstairs specifically, because their futures will diverge from their parents in ways neither Thelma nor Walter could easily picture from inside this one ordinary Wednesday. Raymond, 9 years old tonight, will come of age in a country pulled into a world war before he finishes growing, and the mill that employs his father on reduced shifts this year will run at full capacity and beyond it within a decade, hungry for steel and hungry for men. Alice, 6 tonight, will grow up in a country where a teenage girl going to work in a factory, doing precision work once considered unthinkable for a woman, becomes first a wartime necessity and then, for a great many women, a door that proves difficult to fully close again once opened. Neither child will live a version of their mother's exact life, not because Thelma's life was a failure to be improved upon, but because the entire shape of the country around them is shifting under their feet, slowly enough that nobody living through it that autumn evening could feel it moving. And yet something else deserves to be said plainly here. Something that has less to do with policy and more to do with what actually endures. The exact competence we have watched all day, the mending, the budgeting, the quiet management of scarcity into something resembling comfort, does not disappear once prosperity eventually returns. It becomes, instead, a kind of inheritance passed down through habit rather than instruction. Women who lived through this decade will save string and rubber bands for the rest of their lives. They will patch a garment rather than discard it. Decades after discarding it would cost them nothing at all. Their children, watching this without always understanding why, will absorb a caution around money and waste that outlasts the actual scarcity that created it by 50 years or more. The depression will end. The habits it built into households like this one will not end nearly so cleanly. Something else is coming too, slower moving than a war and less visible than a union drive, but no less consequential for households exactly like this one. Electricity is still a patchwork thing across rural and small-town America in 1934, and Ashwell itself has power along its main commercial blocks, but not yet on every residential street, which is why Thelma's icebox still runs on a block of ice rather than a compressor, and why her stove burns wood scraps rather than drawing current. Within a decade, a federal rural electrification effort will begin pushing power lines out to the corners of the country the private utilities never found profitable enough to reach on their own. And within 2 decades, a great many of the tasks that fill Thelma's day-to-day. The washing, the ironing, the very icebox she manages so carefully will be handed over to machines plugged into a wall socket. This will not happen all at once, and it will not happen evenly. Poorer households and rural households waiting years longer than city ones for the same conveniences. But it is coming, and when it arrives it will quietly retire an entire body of hand skill that women like Thelma spent their whole girlhoods learning. Not because the skill stopped mattering, but because a machine finally learned to do a rougher version of it faster. It is worth pausing on one more thing before we return downstairs to Thelma. The version of this decade most commonly told is a story about men, about bank failures and unemployment lines and government programs debated by men in Washington. All of that is real, and all of it matters, but the actual daily work of surviving those years, the work that determined whether a given family made it through intact or did not, happened overwhelmingly in kitchens exactly like this one, performed by women whose names never appear in any of the history written about this period. Thelma Voss will not be remembered by name outside this house, but multiply her by several million American women doing some close variation of what she did today, and you are looking at the actual mechanism by which an entire country's households absorbed a catastrophe that its economists, its government, and its newspapers are still struggling, even now, to fully understand or fix. The radio program has ended in the front room below, replaced by a late-night announcer reading the following morning's weather, colder, with a chance of frost before dawn. And downstairs, in the lamplight, Thelma is folding the last of the mending back into its basket, unaware of any of the larger currents we have just described, thinking only of tomorrow's ironing and a boy's shoes she has not yet found the money for. Let us step back now from this one Wednesday and look at the whole shape of it together. Because a single day, watched closely enough, tends to reveal patterns that no single hour on its own could show you. The first pattern is the invisibility of labor, and it runs through nearly everything we have watched today. Consider the full accounting of what Thelma actually produced between 5 in the morning and 9 at night. She fed 5 people 3 meals. She baked 4 loaves of bread. She mended a sock, turned a shirt collar, cut a batch of soap, oversaw a coal delivery, washed and dried and folded an entire line of laundry, treated 2 pairs of shoes against the winter ahead, and kept a household ledger accurate to the penny. Any single one of those tasks, performed for wages in Ashwell's small commercial economy, would have earned somebody money. A baker earns money for bread. A seamstress earns money for mending. A laundress earns money for wash. Thelma performed the equivalent of 4 or 5 separate paid trades in a single day, and not $1 of wage attached itself to any of it, because the entire economy built around her work had already decided, long before she was born, that this labor does not count as labor in the way a factory shift counts. It counts as merely being a wife. The distinction is not a small one. It is the reason nobody in 1934, including many of the women doing the work, would think to call what Thelma did today a job. The second pattern is the economics of appearance, and it lives most vividly in that flower sack dress Alice wore to school this morning. A family standing in a town like Ashwell is not measured only by the number written on Walter's pay envelope, which fluctuates week to week in ways nobody controls. It is measured, just as much, by whether the children look cared for, whether the house is clean, whether the family's public face suggests competence even when its private ledger suggests something closer to crisis. This is not vanity, it is a genuinely rational strategy in a town where cash income has become an unreliable measure of a family's worth, so appearance becomes one of the last levers a household can still pull with confidence. Thelma cannot control what the mill pays her husband. She can control entirely how her daughter's dress looks on a Wednesday morning, and she pours a portion of her considerable skill into precisely that lever because it is one of the very few she is allowed to touch. You can trace this same pattern through nearly every choice we watched her make today. The turned collar on Walter's shirt is not only thrift. It is a small guarantee that her husband walks into the mill gate each morning looking like a man whose household has its affairs in order, whatever the truth of the household's affairs actually is. The blacked stove, the scrubbed floor, the mended coat, all of it points the same direction. In a year when a family's real financial position can turn on a single foreman's decision about weekly hours, the one thing that remains fully within a woman's control is how the family presents itself to the street outside its own front door. And Thelma has learned, the way most women of her circumstance have learned, to treat that presentation with the same seriousness other households might reserve for an actual bank balance. The third pattern is the density of obligation, which is simply the fact that Thelma's day contained almost no unstructured time at all. Look back across the hours we have followed. 15 minutes with a cup of coffee before dawn. A few minutes on the settee with Alice before bed. Perhaps 20 minutes total across a 16-hour day. That belonged to nobody's needs but her own, and even those minutes were typically shared with a task happening alongside them. Mending during the radio hour, thinking through Raymond's shoes while kneading bread. Compare that density of obligation against Walter's day, difficult and physically exhausting in its own real way. But bounded, he leaves the mill, and the mill's demands stay largely at the mill. Thelma's obligations have no gate to walk out of. They live inside the same walls she sleeps within, and they begin again the instant she opens her eyes, which is exactly what will happen again tomorrow, and the day after that, for as many years as this household needs her to hold it together. The fourth pattern is the mediated nature of relationships in a town like this one, meaning simply that almost none of Thelma's daily connections to the people around her happen without some object or exchange passing between them. Mrs. Halloran arrives with a jar of applesauce and leaves with news and company. The Hendricks boy delivers coal and leaves with a slice of warm bread he did not ask for, and clearly did not expect. The Ladies' Aid Society distributes charity dressed carefully as neighborliness so that no family need feel the sting of receiving it plainly. Even affection inside the house often travels through a task rather than a direct statement of feeling. Thelma tells Walter she loves him, in the truest sense of the phrase, by turning his collar rather than by saying the words outright, and Walter tells her the same thing by handing over his pay envelope unopened and trusting her completely with what happens to every dollar inside it. It would be a mistake to read this as coldness. It is simply how affection and obligation moved through a household and a town that had, out of long habit, learned to speak most fluently in the language of practical acts rather than declared feelings. The fifth pattern, and perhaps the one that matters most, is the gap between capability and permission. Thelma Voss runs a household with the skill of a trained manager, the technical competence of a seamstress, a cook, a nurse, and an accountant combined, and the judgment of someone who has learned through hard years exactly how far a dollar can be made to stretch before it snaps. If you handed her the mill's payroll ledger, there is no obvious reason to think she would manage it any less capably than the men currently doing so from an office in Pittsburgh, and yet no path exists, in Ashwell in 1934, by which that capability could ever become permission. She cannot vote in most of the elections that shape her town's economic policy in any meaningful sense beyond the ballot itself, since the deeper economic decisions, the mill's hours, its wages, its owner's distant priorities, sit entirely outside any ballot box. She cannot take a wage for the work she performs, because the category of wage labor was never built to include her. She is, in the most literal sense, more competent than the systems around her are willing to recognize, and that gap between what a person can clearly do and what a society permits them to be paid or credited for doing is not unique to 1934. It has simply rarely been as visible as it is in a household run, as this one is, almost entirely on skill with almost no formal recognition attached to any of it. A sixth pattern sits underneath all the others, quieter than the rest, and it is the performance of resilience itself. Thelma does not simply endure her circumstances. She actively performs competence in front of her own household day after day, because a household that senses its manager is afraid tends to become afraid itself. When Walter mentioned the cut mill hours last night in his flat, arithmetic voice, Thelma did not let her own face show the small private jolt of worry the news gave her. When Alice's chest rattled back in September, Thelma tended her without letting the fear in her hands translate into fear in her voice. This is not dishonesty. It is a kind of steady leadership, exercised inside four walls rather than an office or a mill floor, and it costs something real every single day to maintain. An emotional labor stacked on top of every physical task we have already counted. One more form of work this household depends on that will never appear in any ledger Thelma keeps. Taken together, these patterns describe something larger than one family's difficult year. They describe the actual machinery by which an entire country absorbed the worst economic collapse in its history without collapsing itself entirely. A machinery built substantially out of women's unpaid, unrecognized, endlessly resourceful labor, performed in kitchens exactly like this one from coast to coast. Historians will eventually write about relief rolls and bank holidays and public works programs, and they will be right to. But ask what actually held a family like the Vosses together through $11 weeks and half-empty coal tins, and the honest answer has very little to do with Washington and everything to do with a woman who knew how to turn a collar, stretch a soup, and choose the prettiest flour sack in the store. Let us go back to Birch Lane now, because Thelma has one more small round to make before this day is finally allowed to end. She climbs the stairs a little before 10, candle in hand rather than the lamp, since a candle is cheaper to burn for the 30 seconds it takes to check on two sleeping children. Raymond has kicked half his quilt onto the floor the way he does most nights, and she draws it back up over his shoulder without waking him, pausing a moment to listen to the even unremarkable rhythm of his breathing. Alice sleeps curled tight around her rag doll, one thumb loosely near her mouth in a habit Thelma has stopped trying to correct, and Thelma lays the back of her hand briefly against her daughter's forehead, still thinking, even now, of Mrs. Halloran's cough this afternoon. The skin beneath her hand is cool and dry, nothing to worry over tonight. She rubs a little camphorated oil into Alice's chest anyway, a small unnecessary precaution that costs nothing and settles her own mind more than it does anything for the child, who does not so much as stir. Some worries, Thelma has learned, are not meant to be reasoned away. They are meant to be tended, quietly, with whatever small ritual is at hand, until they pass on their own. Back downstairs, the house has gone properly quiet in the way it only does at this hour, a quiet with texture to it rather than simple silence. The stove ticks softly as its iron continues to cool. Somewhere outside a dog barks twice, then stops. The wind that picked up in the afternoon has settled into something gentler now. No more than a low breath along the eaves, and through the front window the street outside sits empty and dark. One lamp still burning 2 doors down at the Hallorans, the rest of Birch Lane already asleep or nearly so. Walter has banked the fire while she was upstairs, closing the stove's draught down to a whisper so the coals will hold their heat through the cold hours ahead without burning away the household's whole supply before morning. It is one of the few household tasks that has quietly become his own over the years, a small division of labour neither of them ever discussed aloud. The way most of what holds a marriage together never gets discussed aloud at all. He sits now in the near dark with the radio off, waiting for her, and when she comes down, he simply reaches for her hand for a moment before letting it go, which is, between the two of them, its own complete sentence. Before she banks herself in for the night, Thelma takes the paper notebook from the kitchen drawer one final time. By the low light of the single candle, she writes the day's accounts in her careful upright hand. Coal, paid in full, the Hendricks boys' weight found honest. 4 loaves of bread, a sock mended, a collar turned, a bar of soap cut and curing on the cellar shelf. A jar of applesauce received from Mrs. Halloran, its value noted the way every gift in this house gets noted, because a family keeping this close an account of itself learns to count kindness the same careful way it counts money. On the facing page, beneath tomorrow's date, 3 lines already wait for the morning that has not yet arrived. Thursday's ironing, the coal ticket to double-check once more against the household scale, just to be certain, and Raymond's shoes underlined twice, a small unsolved arithmetic that will still be waiting, unresolved, when she wakes. This is, in its own way, the truest shape of her life, and perhaps of most lives lived close to the edge of what a household can bear. The day never fully closes before the next one has already begun asserting its claims. Tomorrow's obligations sit written on the page facing today's, close enough to touch, and the same fire that goes to embers tonight will need building again from nothing before the sky outside has even properly lightened. There is no finish line in a life like this one, no evening where the ledger reads even and stays that way. There is only the rhythm of it, repeated, day folding into day. Each one slightly different and each one, underneath the differences, almost exactly the same. And yet, sit with that a moment longer, because it is not, in the end, a sad thing, though it might sound like one described so plainly. There is something that steadies a person in a rhythm this constant, something closer to the comfort of a heartbeat than the weight of a burden. Thelma does not wake each morning dreading the return of the same tasks. She wakes, most mornings, simply beginning them the way you begin breathing again after a long exhale, without deciding to, without needing to decide to, because the deciding was settled long ago and what remains now is only the doing of it, one small competent motion after another. She blows out the candle. The kitchen goes fully dark, lit only by the faint orange seam around the stove's closed damper, and she climbs the stairs behind Walter, feeling her way along the familiar rail in the dark the way she has felt her way along it for a decade, needing no lamp for a path her feet already know by heart. The bedroom is cold, colder than the kitchen was, and she slides in beside her husband under the heavy quilt with the quick, practiced haste of a body that has learned exactly how to get warm fast in an unheated room. Walter is already half asleep, his breathing slowing toward the same even rhythm she listened for in Raymond's room a few minutes ago, and Thelma lies still beside him for a while, staring up into a darkness with no real shape to it, her mind slowing by degrees the way the fire downstairs is slowing by degrees, coal to ember, ember to a warmth with no visible flame left in it at all. She lets her thoughts drift the way she rarely allows herself to during the daylight hours, unhooked now from any task waiting to claim them. The wind along the eaves, the faint creak of the house settling into the cold the way it settles every night at roughly this hour, boards contracting, nails easing fractionally in wood that has held them for 2 decades already and will hold them for 2 decades more. Somewhere below, faint enough that she may only be imagining it. The last of the stove's heat ticking quietly against the iron, she thinks, in no fixed order and with no urgency behind any of it, of the bread rising again tomorrow, of Raymond's shoes, of the coal ticket she will double-check once more out of habit rather than real suspicion, of the way Alice hummed along with the radio theme in a key that matched nothing at all. None of these thoughts arrive with any weight to them now. They simply pass through, the way the day itself is passing, folding closed behind her the further she drifts from it. Her library book waits on the nightstand, unopened tonight. There will not be a chapter read this evening, not after a day like this one, and she is, if she is honest with herself in these last waking minutes, not sorry about it. The book will keep. The woman inside its pages, leaving her small town for the city, will still be waiting there tomorrow night, or the night after, whenever a quarter hour opens up to spend on her. Thelma's own small door marked what if remains closed tonight, not locked, simply closed, the way a good housekeeper closes a door behind her out of habit rather than urgency, knowing perfectly well she can open it again whenever she likes. Outside, Ashwell has gone almost entirely dark now. The mill sits quiet along its bend in the Coldwater River, its furnaces banked down the same way Thelma's own stove is banked down, waiting rather than working, holding just enough heat to start again quickly when the whistle calls the men back at 5:30. Frost is settling once more on the fence rails and the tin roofs. The same frost that sat there this morning before the sun burned it away. Patient, indifferent, entirely unconcerned with how hard any single family in this town worked today to hold its own small corner of the world together. Somewhere down Birch Lane a screen door creaks once and goes still. A dog settles back into its blanket on somebody's porch. The last lit window on the street, 2 doors down at the Hallorans, finally goes dark as well. Further down the hill, past the schoolyard and the Lutheran church with its half-paid stained glass, the mill blocks have gone quiet too. Families in narrow tar-paper houses settling into the same kind of sleep Thelma is settling into now, worn through by their own versions of this same long day. Mrs. Halloran has finally stopped worrying, for tonight at least, about the cough that will not quite clear. The Hendricks boy is asleep with coal dust still faintly grey in the creases of his knuckles, too tired even to properly wash before bed. Old Kessler has closed his ledger for the night behind the dark front window of his store, the pickle barrel and the bin of feed-sack cotton both waiting in the dark for tomorrow's customers. And somewhere on the far edge of town, out past the depot, the relief office sits locked and empty until morning, holding, behind its door, whatever quiet arithmetic of need the coming winter will bring to families who have not yet had to walk through it. All of it rests now. This whole tired, resourceful, quietly proud town of 9,000 people, giving itself over to a few hours of stillness before the whistle calls it all back into motion again. I want to leave you here, my friend, in that dark and ordinary house, because I think there is something worth carrying with you into your own sleep tonight. Thelma Voss will never appear in a history book. No statue will be built for her, no plaque mounted on the Birch Lane house where she raised 2 children through the hardest years her country had yet seen. But she did something that mattered, every single day, with a competence so complete it looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. A flour sack became a dress a child was proud to wear. A worn collar found a second life. A soup fed a family for 2 more days on almost nothing. None of it was remarkable in the way we usually mean that word. All of it was, in the way that actually counts. Wherever you are tonight, whatever your own version of Thelma's ledger looks like, however full or empty the coffee tin on your own shelf might be, I hope some small part of her steadiness stays with you as you drift off. You have carried enough for one day. You do not have to carry anything else until morning. The lamps are going out now, one by one, down Birch Lane and everywhere else. The world is quiet. Rest well.